Hello. For those of you who don't know me, my name's Helen Mountfield. I'm the principal at Mansfield College, and I'm very pleased to welcome you to the first of this term's Friday Mansfield Public Talks. The idea of these talks is that they stimulate discussion inside the college and the university and outside it. Because we want to share information and ideas very widely, they are all free. And obviously at the moment, they're also all online, which means that we can reach a wider group of people. Our first speakers of this term, who I'm sure are going to suddenly pop up in glorious Technicolor in a moment. There's Alastair in sort of glorious Technicolor.
In a rather rundown hotel in the north of England.
Oh, right. and Fiona, who's not in a rundown hotel in the north of England. So Alastair Campbell and Fiona Millar are our first speakers of this term. I'm very grateful for them being here. The book we're speaking about, I want to show you the book we are speaking about, there we are. Living Better, How I Learned to Survive Depression, is by Alastair. It has a very important almost last word chapter by Fiona, also about how to live with depression from the point of view of partner and family member. I mean, one of the things that I've noticed about people when they are depressed is it's very, and myself sometimes, I think I'm low in general, but it's very hard to make yourself do those. It's hard to do those things, and harder to make yourself sleep or eat properly or take some exercise when you're feeling low, because you can't quite face it.
It is, but it is hard, and I still find it hard, but it's easier if you're being honest about it, if you're being open about it. So for years and years and years and years, when I felt depressed, I would say I was fine. I wouldn't open up about it. I'd just be kind of miserable to live with. Whereas now, the first thing I do when I feel the depression coming on, often first thing in the morning when I wake up, is I tell Fiona. She has her way of dealing with it. I have my way of dealing with it. But those things, so like, for example, exercise, doing exercise every day. I might say to myself, right, well, I can't face going out. So I'll walk up and down the stairs 10 times. At least I'll do it. It won't be the same as, going for an hour-long run or swimming in the, freezing cold water, but it will be exercise. I might have 5 things that I'm meant to do that day. I'll find a way of not cancelling them. I might cut 30 minutes down to 5 minutes, but I'm not cancelling. And I think I do that because I force myself to be open. I could be wrong. It might just be that I'm older and I've got a different life, but I think it's like the day I describe in the book, the day that I had this kind of really suicidal episode, the next day I sat down with my visual jam jar and I ticked them all off one by one. Burnley, I phoned the manager for a chat. Bagpipes, I played them. Exercise, I did go for a run. I did listen to music. I did read. I did write something. Now, maybe I would have done anyway, but I think what I might have done in the past is I'd have hidden away. I'd have gone to bed. I'd stayed in bed all day.
Yeah. So do you think this is, because it all sounds like, very good advice for living a healthful and wholesome life. I mean, do you think this is stuff that everyone should do?
Yeah. I mean, look, let me say, by the way, including during the first lockdown, I still get really bad depression, and I still get where I can't do those things. And I still get times when I do just hide away. But the gaps seem to me to be getting longer, and the intensity seems to lift a little bit quicker, I think. But listen, one of the things I'm really, really chuffed about, I was saying this to your students earlier, that I had a letter the other day from an NHS trust where I've been doing a talk, actually where I met the lady with the woman who's bipolar, and they said they're getting all their staff to do their jam jars. And a head teacher recently said the same. I've had people who work in the military who say the same. So, and what I think it hopefully helps people to do is, and I think this is what we need to do as a country, by the way, is move away from what we have now, which is a mental illness service, and develop a mental health strategy for all of us, which means that hopefully most people will never have to use a mental illness service.
Yeah. Yeah. And that's very interesting stuff. The bottom layer of your jam jar, or the fundamental layer, is your FFF, Fiona Family and Friends. And at the moment, the COVID crisis means quite a lot of people are away from those things, or just don't have them around. I mean, do you know, and people have talked about the crisis of loneliness in our society. I mean, how do you think we could make social policy better to kind of avoid some of the causes of depression, I suppose?
Well, I think the first thing I say about, I mean, I actually thought at the start of this whole wretched COVID thing, I thought, well, the one thing it might lead to is a complete rethinking of mental health strategy. And I think in some countries that is happening. It's so not happening in the UK. It's happening a bit in Scotland, it's happening a bit in Wales. But they both actually got recently appointed ministers who I think are taking a new approach. Hands up anybody on this call who knows who the UK government mental health minister is. Hands up who feels really great if I tell you that it's Nadine Dorries. This is not a priority for Boris Johnson's government. But I actually think that, you know, I'm not sure that I would put loneliness, listen, there are mental illness consequences to loneliness, of course, but I think that it's part of this. But I actually think that if we could change the lens on how we think about mental health, starting in schools, starting in families, universities, incredibly important on this, and actually start to flip it from this, how do we get good mental health? How do we work ourselves to get good mental health, as opposed to how do we just invest more and more money in mental illness? That's the way we've got to flip it. So that's how I would say I would change social policy. Let's have a complete reconfiguration of our attitudes to mental health.
Yeah. I mean, Fiona, you're the person with a long-standing interest in education policy. And how do you think that schools and universities could better educate and equip students to have good mental health?
I really think you've got to go back before that. I mean, the truth is we don't really put children and young people at the heart of policy making in our society. And actually, if you did say children were going to be at the heart of everything, a lot of decisions would be very, very different. And the first one would be that you would have to build this support and intervention from before children start school, because what you'll be dealing with at undergraduate level is things that in some cases may be too late to resolve. So, and I think one of the problems with the current lockdown is the isolation. I was very struck by something I read when people said, oh, it's just like the war. The difference with the war was that people could communicate with each other. They could be together. So there was a sense of social solidarity to help them through it. We haven't been able to do that. And in a lot of communities, that social solidarity is broken down at the best of times when we're not in lockdown. And people carry the baggage with them. So I think building those strong communities, now that may be in, you know, early years, sure start around schools, and that's why I feel so strongly about state schools, because I think they are a fantastic vehicle to do so much of this stuff. But even in universities, you know, having opportunities where people can come together and talk. I mean, you know, why not have a talk at the start of every year, all the freshers come about mental health, somebody like Alastair talking about it, and then encouraging them to go off and do their jam jar, or have a place where people could go and have a, like, I mean, I talked about AA and Al-Anon earlier on. I mean, I think that concept of having a place where you can go and feel supported just to share things, even if you're not getting sort of diagnosed or treated, is incredibly important, because often it's bottling things up that makes everything worse.
Yeah, excellent. So it's 15th of October at 2:30, Alastair, okay? Your talk.
Right.
Starting point. Yeah.
Listen, just one thing on that though. You remember, you know, when we were in power, and the whole sort of thing, you know, the kind of explosion in classroom assistance, which I think was, you know, really, I mean, Sure Start definitely was really important, and, you know, one of the many wretched changes in the last decade or so. But I think we're getting to a place where that kind of classroom assistant approach, with somebody who is trained in spotting signs and trained in mental health first aid and mental health support, and then for that to go through the school system and college system, I think we'd end up as a country saving billions and billions and billions in the probation system, in the court system, in the prison system, in divorce, and of course in the health system. If we actually thought part of the whole shtick of raising and educating children is to give them mental health and resilience support. We don't do
how does that fit in with the criticism that's sometimes made by people in my generation? We never had that, you know. They call it anxiety. I called it splitting up with a boyfriend and having finals. Tell them to get over it. I mean, you know, are we treating people to sort of pathologize the human condition, or do you think, you know, how do you make people resilient about mental health with the kind of help you're talking about?
I mean, I think there's no. I guess that attitude is both, it's real, and there may be something in it, but I think it's because it was a very, very different time. And I also think that attitude did an awful lot of damage to people. When I look at our kids' generation, and you know, when I see them with their friends and so forth, I've got no doubt at all that yes, they're more open, but I also do think that there is more anxiety about the state of the world. I think there is more depression. I think that people, the stiff upper lip thing and the sort of get on with it, I think maybe for whatever reason, I think people were maybe found life easier when, you know, Fiona's got a friend who's a doctor who, you know, has got this theory that, you know, we've never had, well, we do at the moment because of the pandemic, we've never really had these kind of big existential challenges which previous generations have had. And so the lack of that has maybe opened up this idea that, you know, oh, we're all struggling and we're all, you know, you're nobody if you haven't got a mental health problem. It's like, you know, but I think it's real. I think young people are justifiably struggling for lots and lots of reasons at the moment. And saying that, you know, we didn't have it in my day and we should just shut up and shoulder it, you know, and get on with it, I think is really dangerous. And
also, I don't think you can exclude the difference that social media is making to a lot of young people. And I think talk to any mental health professionals about what's going on in the younger generation, and so much of it is now linked to social media, the way people feel judged, the objectification, and we don't really quite know how to manage that yet. And a lot of it is very private and secret and going on behind closed doors, and parents can't see it and so on, schools can't see it. Explosion of pornography, young men. I mean, there's a lot of very worrying things that didn't exist, but generally I think a lot of people were repressing problems that they ought to have been talking about before. So when people say this explosion in mental health isn't real, it is partly because people are coming forward and saying, I don't feel great. And that's generally a good thing, I'd say.
I had recently, I did my first Zoom funeral recently, which is a really strange experience, but it was actually, it was a cousin of my mum, really, really lovely woman called Sheena. And I had actually spoken to her not long ago because she'd read the book about the depression thing. And she said, God, I wish we'd been able to do this when I was younger. And the reason I think Sheena and I always had an empathy was because I can remember whenever she came to see us, she'd just be a bit careful with Sheena. She has very bad nerves. And that was the language of the time. She has very bad nerves. And that could have meant anything. But actually, and she told me, I had a few generations back on my mum's side, who were generally pretty good on the mental health front, but there was a double suicide within a family. And Sheena said that they just never, ever, ever talked about it. And she, you know, it's just crazy that you can't have something like that happen in a family and then you just don't talk about it. That does stuff to people.
Yeah, I mean, I was talking to an amazing woman today in London who's a young Black mental health advocate, and she's partly talking about sort of decolonizing the school curriculums and giving people a voice and making them feel that they matter. But she's talking about lack of mental health support for young Black people in particular. And one of the things she was saying is that she thinks we need a more community-based approach to mental health problems. They're very individualized. They're very you and your problem. Whereas we should be looking, you were saying earlier, Alastair, you know, there are a lot of these problems, they just weren't talked about. So people of my parents' generation often had absent parents or parents whose relationships had been messed up by war and had dealt with a lot of that stuff, and then went through a lot of social revolutions that weren't really perhaps acknowledged, and then I think man hands on misery to man and all that. We are partly the product of our society, and you're talking about not facing big existential threats, but there's not much more existential a threat than the climate crisis. And
exactly,
I understand why people feel depressed and scared about that, and slightly hard to know what to do as an individual.
No, if you're a young person at the moment, right, climate change is obviously kind of like the biggest, but then you've got the pandemic comes along as well. You've got Donald Trump, sort of, that I think most young people outside those that really love him in America find, truly repugnant. We have 4 years of that. I think actually people feel an awful lot. A lot of people I know feel the same about our government, not quite as bad, but they're getting there. And, added to which, you've got now with the pandemic, real, genuine insecurity about your own economic future and economic prospects. It's bloody awful. Mm-hmm. So the idea that is not going to produce psychological and psychiatric consequence, it is. And that's why I just wish that the government would, rather than say everything's going great, we're all fine, and we're spending, Johnson said the other day, we're spending 12 billion on mental health. I mean, I don't know where he got that from. That's out by a factor of 24.
No, it's great. There's 350 million a week, which we've saved from being members. Honestly,
I've done very well so far. I've not even mentioned Brexit.
Yeah, no, well, let's not. That would be terrible. But yeah, I mean, how would you structure mental health support? Given our current NHS model, which in a sense is quite a reactive problem-solving one, and we haven't really joined up public health and solving problems when they arise.
I would, and I don't think this actually would be quite difficult to do. I think this is where actually the Scots and the Welsh are starting to begin to go. Rather than just thinking about mental health policy, as in how much are we going to put into it and what's that going to do, develop a kind of national mental health strategy that does involve all of these different parts of our national life. I actually think business, for example, it's really interesting, the banks. I did an incredible thing the other day with the Bank of Ireland. I did a talk to all of their staff, 3,000 of them. And the reason they wanted to do was talk about mental health, but then the CEO came on. And the reason they were doing this event was because he said, we're going through this terrible time. And I'm here announcing today that from henceforth now, the mental health of our staff and the well-being of our staff is our single most important priority. And then going into, this is the boss of a bank saying, and that means that we say to clients, our managers say to clients, no, if they don't answer emails at weekends, that's because they've been told they don't have to answer emails at weekends. They all get given time off for themselves, and they have a strategy. They have somebody within the bank who's appointed to advise them on how to rest, how to relax, how to chill out. Now, I think there's a reason why the banks are sort of bizarrely leading the way in this. It's because most of them lost people to suicide during the global financial crisis. So they've had it, they've confronted it. I did a thing with the Time to Change campaign before the government stopped funding it. They obviously couldn't find the money in this mythical, fictional £12 billion, the Time to Change campaign. And we did a thing at the stock exchange where if it's still there, you go into the first floor on the stock exchange and right there's a desk that's been kept untouched since the guy who sat there killed himself during the crisis. And they're doing that, and they likewise are taking on a strategy. So I think there's an awful lot that employers can do and are doing, but then they've got to be encouraged to do that within a broader strategy. So actually you could come along then with government coming along with, incentives for people to invest in that through the firms and so forth. And I think if you do that there, then you do the sort of stuff that I'm talking about in schools and colleges, then it doesn't all have to be about, raiding the government bank.
Yeah. I mean, one of the problems I think that arises with that, I'm just thinking of a sister-in-law of mine who's teaches in an early years setting where, only key workers have their kids at school. That's everybody really. And she doesn't have any PPE and she's not going to have a vaccine and she's bit older than me, and it's very stressful. You end up often with, and this certainly happens in the health system at the moment, and it happens in the education system. Who's going to help who? There's a sort of vast wave of people who really need a lot of help and support and are struggling themselves. And so are the people who are meant to be delivering these services. And there's more and more and more need, and somebody's going to break. And I don't really, that's why I wonder how we structure this in a way that is going to help, provide the resource we need.
Yeah, well, but I agree with that. And I think that you go across, for years we've been talking about, the reforms that are going to be made to the social care sector, which have not happened. And a lot of the loneliness you were talking about isn't there. A lot of the problems that we're going to get arising out of COVID are in there. So I'm not saying that isn't a big part of this, but I actually, speaking as somebody who doesn't much trust this government to get the mental health agenda, I'm kind of focusing on the stuff that can be done almost like despite the government, out with the government, including, I think, in places like academia.
Yeah. Okay. I mean, I'm taking questions as they come in the Q&A box, participants. So do pick them up. I know one.
By the way, Helen, you know that I've got to run in 8 minutes, don't you?
I do, yes, and that's why I'm just making.
I'm doing another mental health talk.
Points they want to make, please put them in the Q&A box, especially that point about academia, because obviously there's academics and students on here. So questions about that would be very welcome. I have got a question here from somebody who says that because you've been talking about openness, have you ever felt that as a result of being open about this, you're losing control of the narrative? So you tell a story because you think it's going to help you, and then others take it on, and there are things you might not want people to know about you. And how do you deal with it? How do you control your own narrative, or try to?
No, I mean, I've never ever regretted being open, ever, not once. Not once. I remember at the start, both Fiona and my mum were both very worried about it. I think I wrote a novel about a psychiatrist, then I made a film, and then I started going out and doing stuff and what have you. And but I just had this instinct that it was what I should do, and that my skills lent themselves to it. But also I sort of felt that it would be an important part of me being better. So I have never ever regretted it. I understand why other people don't want to be, by the way. It's a very, very personal thing. I never say, you should be open. How can you sit there with your bipolar disorder and not tell people? What do you mean you've got OCD, but you don't want to tell anybody? I mean, I get that, but I think if we all made the leap together, we'd transform the world. I really do.
Yeah. An interesting question on that here from somebody who says, what would you say to somebody who is affected by a mental health issue, but feels they don't really have the right to complain or seek treatment, given kind of existential challenges people are facing in the globe, around the globe, and see this as a sort of luxury problem. What's wrong with you? And actually, you talk about this in your book. You have a good life. You're successful. You've got a happy marriage.
Right, but would they say that if they, walked out here and fell off the pavement and broke their ankle, that they don't have the right to go and get it fixed in hospital? Would they say that if they got, cold, they don't want to go and get some cold remedy? Would they say that if they were asthmatic, they shouldn't be entitled to an inhaler? I mean, I just think we've got to think of it in those terms. It's not a luxury.
Yeah.
If you are feeling that your health, mental health and well-being is affecting your sense of self, your work and your relationships, then I think it's, go and try to get help.
And there is a huge cost to society from people being mentally unwell, relationship breakdowns, time off work, on the benefit system. A lot of people on the benefit system with mental health problems. So it's a false economy, to say.
Yeah.
There's a very interesting question here, because Alistair, you talked about another couple of things in your jar, meaningful activity. And somebody, I think this is interesting in the light of the changing workplace and a lot of people's jobs having been either taken from them or rendered less meaningful. How do you find meaning in a world where it's easy to feel you're a second-rate computer, is the way the question's been put? But people, it links to what you were saying about communities and valuable work. It's a tricky.
Well, because but why do they feel like a computer? Because they're algorithmized, and I don't.
Well, I think possibly. I mean, this is one of the annoying things about not being in a room where somebody can explain themselves a bit more.
Ask them to just ping in another thought.
Yeah. Okay. Ping in another thought, Frank, and we'll try and answer that one. Yeah. Yeah. So then I've got a couple of questions which are for people who live with people with depression. And if you don't mind, I'm going to leave those for a minute because I know you can stay a few minutes longer, Fiona. I have a question saying we didn't plan very well for the epidemic. What would your 3-point plan be for the mental health epidemic at the end?
Prepare for it now.
Yeah.
Bring in people of genuine commitment and expertise who've got amazing experience already. So, for example, funny enough, a text just pinged in from one of them, but Paul Farmer from Mind, Simon Wesley at the Royal College of Psychiatry, Dennis Stevenson, these people have been involved in doing the sort of stuff you were talking about earlier, reviewing mental health policy, mental health services. They've done stuff that has been sitting on a shelf for about 5-6 years. And actually to bring them in now and say, okay, the game has changed. We've got to use this COVID crisis to reshape, reconfigure a mental health strategy, not mental health services, that will be part of the strategy. And then bring in those outsiders now to prepare for us. That's the first thing, do it now. Of the key things that I think should then flow from that, one would be a special focus upon frontline health workers, because, you know, I don't know if you saw that thing recently about PTSD. And then the second thing I would say would be schools and colleges, and do that, prepare for that now. And I actually think, I'm absolutely convinced there is a way of doing that that is not going to be as expensive as it sounds, by involving business, by involving other partners.
Yeah. And do you think there are special stigmas? Somebody talked about what I said about macho atmospheres. Do you think there are special stigmas and perhaps special help that men need to confront their mental health issues? Do you think the men's health movement has a value?
Oh yeah, definitely. I think that, look, I think it's a bit of a sexual cliche stereotype. You know, women don't mind talking about their problems, and, you know, men are always very, very clammed up. You know, some women hate talking about their problems as well. It's not kind of, you know, black and white. But I think if you think that suicide is now the biggest killer of young men in the UK, and that's just like, if you deleted suicide and put any other condition, right, there'd be an outcry. You know, I don't know, obesity is the biggest killer of young men. We do something. Asthma is the biggest killer of young men. Diabetes is the biggest killer of young men. Suicide is the biggest killer of young men in the United Kingdom.
Deaths of despair. Okay, just before you go, Alastair, I've got someone, an engineering scientist who I think has tried to pin down this lack of sense of meaning question a bit more, saying the challenge for work is to create work that allows for a sense of autonomy and purpose, where you have some control and choice over your work. So, and the pandemic's kind of shown that people are not very good at being bored. So if your workplace is kind of automatized and you have less sense of control over your work, is that a mental health problem? And how do you think we change that?
Oh God, I don't know. I really don't know.
He can't even do Zoom on his own, so you're doing the wrong person.
I've had the whole hotel staff up with me today getting this set up. I honestly, listen, that is definitely one for Fiona, because she's got a brain, a technological brain. I'm the artist in the family. All
right, you can go and play your bagpipes then, or get on to your next call with.
Listen, I'm sorry I've got to run, but I did sort of double book.
Yeah, all right. Listen, thank you very much, Alastair. And if you don't mind, Fiona, I'm going to stay and ask some of the questions, especially now he's gone. Bye-bye, Alastair. Thank you very much.
Bye. I can tell the real story now.
Yeah, go on. So, yeah. Yeah, so where we are, yes. So somebody's asked what kind of coping methods you used to help Alastair through, but also how you coped yourself.
Well, I cope with it through exercise. I've always been a fanatical swimmer, and I'm really struggling at the moment because I can't swim. So that was my way of dealing with it. But I think the real coping strategy came when I understood that I didn't need to blame myself for it, because for the most of the first 35 years, I thought I was doing something wrong, and that must be why he was depressed. So I absorbed a lot of the responsibility for it, and that made me feel pretty bad. And since I've learned how not to do that anymore, it's been much easier to cope with it. I'm not saying I switch off for it. I'm conscious of what's going on, and I'm aware of it, and I try not to do things that will inflame the situation, but I don't go around beating myself up all the time about it, because I do understand that something else is going on there. And I'm afraid to say, I think people with mental illness can be quite manipulative at times, whether it's deliberate or not, but or subconscious, but they can make you feel as if you're responsible for it. You should be doing more to make them feel better, and that things are their fault, your fault.
And how do you help yourself to sort of get over that without just sort of telling them to leave, sort them out themselves and go? I mean, somebody said, do you feel guilty? Do you?
I felt guilty for years, because it seemed the way it was playing out, it was like he'd get very upset and be very miserable and not want to get out of bed. So your obvious reaction is, there's something wrong in this house. I must be doing something wrong. There's something wrong with me. I'm not. And then I said, well, how can I help? What can I do? And I think in some ways I was over-functionalizing, always trying to put it right, when in fact it wasn't going to be put right. And I think what he really wanted was somebody who was sort of there, but not trying to put it right, and just sort of, I don't know. I still don't really know what he wants. Sometimes I say to him, you cannot tell me, what do you want me to do? Tell me what would be the reaction that would make you feel better. And he can't articulate it. It's really difficult. But I don't take it personally in the way that I used to do.
Yeah. But given that you can't fix it, you can't fix it for someone, do you think there are ever circumstances, I'm ventriloquizing another question here, where you should, somebody with mental health problems or real distress has a sort of duty, or it might help to protect your loved ones, or maybe your children? I mean, do you think?
I know. I mean, lots of people have contacted me since we've been going public about this, and I'm afraid I was in the situation with you, but I couldn't cope with it and I left. And I had several occasions when I did think about it, but whatever it is, I mean, it's a very personal reaction, isn't it? I can't speak for what's right for other people, but the right thing for me was to stay and to try and make it better. I mean, that probably is quite in my personality anyway, but and now I'm really glad that I did. I'm really glad that I did, but it was very, very hard at times. And in fact, when Alastair had his first breakdown, before we had children, I can remember him having a terrible sort of meltdown one night. He was almost frothing at the mouth. And my father said to me at the time, are you sure you want to stay with him? And in that moment, it's always stuck in my mind. I said, yeah, I could see it was a yes or no question, but I decided to stay. And I think that was the moment really that I made that commitment to going along with it.
Yeah.
Without really knowing what it was going to mean in practice. But
yeah. Well, Alastair writes slightly ruefully in the book about you saying, yeah, on balance. I'm probably going to say, what do you mean on balance?
You can't pretend that it's all hearts and flowers, and anybody who's listening into this, who's in this situation, you know that it isn't. And in fact, one of the things I have done since the book came out is I've set up a little support group, really as a model to see if we can get something going that will help the families and partners of people who are suffering from depression. And it's been really interesting. Had a lot of reaction, good little groups of people now meeting up once a month to talk about it, thinking where that can go next. But there's an unmet demand there for people to be able to share, and also in a non-judgmental way, because I think what I've heard a lot of people have said to me, I talked to my friends about it, and they said, oh, he's awful, just leave him. Well, that's really unhelpful advice, isn't it? Especially if you have got children. No. You want to be able to know other people who've gone through similar things and what helped them and how that might help you. So if anybody out there wants to recommend somebody, they should email me and I'll put them on our little list and they can join our group. And if it works, great. Well, I'll be explaining to people how they can set groups up like this around the country, because I do think that doing it as a little community is so much more effective than doing it on your own.
It's interesting that you talked about the breakdown of community, and there aren't the obvious community places to go. And somebody has asked, and I was wondering whether you think this is something that needs some kind of specialist mental health expertise. Somebody said, where do ordinary folk go for help? And of course, there is a huge dearth of mental.
There isn't anywhere. But I think, one of the things about Sure Start, for example, was it was a place where people came together and met at a time in their lives. Young women, young mothers could be vulnerable, needed help. It provided access and signposting to other services. And I do think the principle of using the public services that do exist as a way through to people to reach the services they need is very powerful. That's kind of broken down in the last 10 years. But I think the Labour government, one of the good things it was trying to do was to build those services and links through schools and through early years settings and so on. So I think places, you just look at the way so many people are living now. They don't have those community links, which could help them find the support they need. I really think that's the key. So it has to happen at a local level, I think. everything's too centrally controlled at the moment, I feel. I think the communities coming together could find ways to build those networks, which would start that process.
Yeah, that's interesting. And there's somebody here from Germany who's talked about how in Germany, the starting point is talking therapy and community groups, and medication is really a last resort, which doesn't seem to be the
That's
case
interesting. It seems to me so sensible.
Yeah.
I know that.
And but what they ask, you may have a different perspective on this from Alastair, you can say what you want because it's odd, but this person has asked whether you could elaborate about what you think are the benefits of talking therapy and medication. I think you and Alastair maybe have different views on.
Yeah. I mean, I haven't, look, I think I have pretty good mental health. I have had some talking therapies, but it's been really mainly to help me deal with the other people in my family who have got mental health problems. And I'm very persuaded of the fact that underlying Alastair's depression, there's something else going on that hasn't been explored, and he doesn't really want to explore it. But so that's personal for him and with his psychiatrist, and they found that the medication is what works for him. I'm sure that is true as well. But I do think that often there are things going on more profoundly that might be underlying some of these conditions like depression. And sometimes I think the day when he started punching himself, I thought, there's some self-hate here going on. And probably a lot of insecurity as well, allied to his over-functionalization and great success.
And do you think, as talked about, not really thinking it's all about sort of being happy hearts and flowers all the time, it's about a meaningful life. I mean, what do you think about that? Do you think, how do you think people think this is good enough, this is happy enough?
Yeah, but I think that's one of the things we need to help people to understand from a very young age. I mean, they are starting to do things like mindfulness in schools. I mean, one of the problems with young people's lives today is they're so pressured to achieve. Nobody gets time to sit back and talk about how they feel and what might make them feel better. But I think giving some time in young people's lives to provide them with that opportunity to learn to reflect on what makes them feel good and what a good life means to them is profound, because it's going to be very different for everybody. We can't all say what a good life is. I know in this current circumstance what a good life is for me. I mean, it'd be better if I could swim, but I walk every day, I do yoga every day, I work every day, I have a routine. That's keeping me going through this. It might not be the same for other people, but I think you need to find the time to explore what is the best way to keep you mentally healthy as well as physically healthy.
Yeah. Thank you, Fiona. I think that's really helpful. And finally, I think somebody in the chat box has put in, and this is helpful for anyone who's here, that Oxfordshire Mind has an information line which anyone can phone for mental health signposting or information for themselves or their loved ones. And I can send that to anyone who wants it, the information, and but it's info@oxfordshiremind.org.uk, and there's a phone number there. So I do think it's probably quite important to end with a little bit of signposting. If you're in the university, there's the counselling service has pages, and if you're in Mansfield College, all our welfare resources are in the weekly virtual quad magazine. So please don't try to suffer on your own. And somebody finally who's a mental health first aid instructor, who's looking at some of the ways that sessions can be rolled out in various departments in the university, thinks it is very important to try to participate in community groups, walk and talk, chat rooms, which are available in the university and outside. And I suppose what you and Alastair have been talking about, Fiona, which is trying to break the stigma and think it's all right to talk about this stuff. This is part
also,
of
if you've got somebody you care about, don't let them go. Try and help them, to persuade them to get some help. That seems to be terribly important. Getting the help, that first step to get help is absolutely critical, and a lot of people don't take it. So if you've got somebody you care about and you're worried about, and a great act of friendship would be to help them, nudge them into that, taking that step to seek professional help. Because if Alastair had professional help much earlier, a lot of this wouldn't have happened to us.
Yeah. Well, thank you very much, Fiona. And also, finally, somebody's put up, if it's not too late, that Oxford Nightline is also available every evening for students. And they put oxfordnightline.org in the box. So thank you very much for sharing those insights on living better.
I mean, actually, coming to Mansfield was the last almost normal thing I did, because I think the lockdown happened next week. It's stuck in my mind as this great professional day out when I came and met people and talked to them in the flesh and interviewed them.
Well, yes. Well, it was nice to see you too. And I hope we'll be able to have you here in real life at some point. But thank you all very much for listening, as well as to Fiona and Alastair for this talk. Do look at the list of talks, which is on our website, on our Public Talks page, all online this term, and you can sign up next week, Friday at 5:30. We have Professor Cheryl Cashin, who's a professor of race relations and civil rights law at Georgetown University. She was a Marshall Scholar at Oxford. She's written some really interesting books about geography and race, and her book is about racial healing in the Biden era in the United States. She's a fantastic speaker, very interesting woman. So do please sign up for that, or tell anyone you know who's interested, and spread the word about our Mansfield Public Talks, because the idea of these is that education and ideas should be shared, and we can all help each other by creating communities, including communities of ideas. So thank you all very much, and thank you, Fiona, and I'll see some of you next week. Goodbye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.